Greetings, Missouri Mid-South Conference. I bring you greetings from the conference office where I have returned briefly from a few days of vacation after a wonderful conference annual gathering in Columbia, Missouri. Big shout out of thanks to the conference annual gathering planning team co-chaired by Rick Oberly and Jane Porchy. Everything went very smoothly, and from what I've heard from other folks, I'm biased, but it sounded like other people had a similar experience of renewed relationships and strong and nourishing conversations and learnings and worship and workshops and all kinds of things. So thank you to all who led and participated and were a part of our successful conference annual gathering. A part of the conference annual gathering that I participated in was my annual State of the Conference address, where I offer my assessment of where we are as a conference and then a new conference ministry theme for the upcoming year, as well as two visions of guiding ways that we can live into our conference ministry theme and continue to be dynamic and vital and offer that support and presence for our local churches. So last year, leading up to last week's conference annual gathering, the conference ministry theme was serving God's beloved community now, and we did it in some wonderful ways. And the conference ministry theme that is going to start now, going up to the 2019 CAG, is building courageous relationships. Understanding that all that we do as the church in all different aspects of the church require relationships, whether it is within our local churches or with our neighbors, with community groups, with our missions and social service and social justice connections, whether it is with the association and with the conference and the national setting. We have to be about building courageous relationships, not just in the places where we agree, either ideologically or politically or theologically, but also in the places where we may disagree and where we may not necessarily immediately connect together. Those are the very places that I would encourage us to lean into the challenge as the Missouri Mid-South Conference in all different perspectives in order to be building courageous relationships. And I used Paul's letter to Romans, which has been used a lot recently in the news, and talked about that God's law is the ultimate law, and that for Paul, God's law is to love your neighbor as yourself, and that is our theological basis by which we are to be building courageous relationships. In fact, Christ gives us that example of how we build courageous relationships with different people that Jesus was often connecting with in many ways. There are four different areas that I believe that we in different places in the conference and in the local church setting can be building courageous relationships. Number one is the relationship between pastors and church leaders and members. This area we can always be strengthening in healthy times when we agree and we celebrate and things are going well, and especially in the moments where there may be conflict and turmoil. Those relationships have to be strong in order for us to trust one another with our disagreements and how we work through that in a healthy way as a local church. The second area of relationships is relationships among churches to be sharing ministry together. So we've been talking a lot about how do we share ministry in this new time. Churches that are geographically close, that may be able to share in youth ministry, where one church may have a few youth and another church may have a few youth. And you may not be able to do things separately, but if you share ministry, all kinds of possibilities open up We've also been looking at this in terms of yoked churches and what this looks like in the 21st century and how we can be supportive of this for our churches and for our ministers as well. The third area of relationship building is relationships between our associations and the Missouri Mid-South Conference. We are extremely fortunate that in the Missouri Mid-South Conference, we have 3 very strong and very dynamic associations: the Eastern Association, the St. Louis Association, and the Western Association, and each one has strong leaders and committees and financial opportunities. And so we want to make sure that we're in covenant with one another. I'm aware that there has been pain in the past between conference minister, conference leadership, as well as the association, councils, leaders, and everyone else. So this is a year in which we do some intentional relationship building of how we are to be the church together, where we collaborate together. And then the fourth different type of relationship where my hope is that we are building relationships is relationships among conference and the national setting of the UCC. Often wherever I go, whether it's a local church or association or conference, sometimes we get into this thinking of the national setting is them and we are us, and it almost pits us against one another or in silos. Maybe we respect what national does, but we are doing our own thing. And my hope is that we can continue to cultivate and strengthen our relationships with the national setting, that they not necessarily are the place where they tell us what to do and they give us all the information and they are the end-all be-all of all things knowledgeable about the church, but instead that it's a relationship in which they are learning what we're doing on the ground in our local churches, and they can connect us with different places throughout the United Church of Christ that may be doing similar ministries, so that we're not recreating the wheel, but that we are collaborating together to continue Christ's mission in the world. So in my State of the Conference and offering the conference ministry theme of building courageous relationships, I offered 2 visions that I provide as ways that I believe we could be using to build courageous relationships. And I offer these both at CAG and with you right now, and I begin by saying, I, as your conference minister, have no authority. So I offer these visions as what they are, visions. And I offer them as seeds that I am going to be scattering amongst us, knowing that I have no authority to enact anything, that instead I offer them as seeds. And if they fall on fertile ground and they pick up momentum, wonderful. And if they fall on fallow ground and they go nowhere and nothing happens for the next year, wonderful. That is the beauty of the United Church of Christ in terms of you have the ultimate authority in our conference council and our associations and our local churches. You have the ultimate authority. My role is to offer vision, offer some focus and some guidance of who and how we can be the church in the upcoming year. So the 2 visions that I offer as we are building courageous relationships together in 2018, 2019, number 1 is to develop 3 new church starts in the Missouri Mid-South Conference by 2020, which is in 2 years. Vision number 2, to double the authorized ministers who are under 40 years old in the conference by 2020, which is in 2 years. Now I'm going to kind of flesh these out a little bit in just a second, but I'm going to name that as you hear them, you may be thinking, holy moly, Ginny, what in the world are you thinking? That is not just ambitious, but that is Pollyanna-ish, and there is no way that we're going to be able to do that. And so you're kind of setting us up to fail. And what I would say is, I don't think that I'm setting us up to fail. I see that there is a need out there. I see that there is a potential, and I want to challenge us enough that it's gonna cause us to really sacrifice on all levels in order to even fathom getting close to either one of those visions. And if we don't accomplish either of the visions, I'm okay with that. But at least we have some guidance of where we're going together and how we can get there as the Missouri Mid-South Conference. So, vision number 1, to develop 3 new church starts in the conference by 2020, in 2 years. 2 statistics I want to give to you. One is from the United Church of Christ, the National, and that is that since the year 2000, which is 18 years ago, 4% of all of our churches have been formed since 2000. So of all of our churches that are in existence today, only 4% of them were formed in the last 18 years. It's pretty significant. Another statistic from the Missouri Mid-South Conference is that since 2000, again, 18 years ago, there have only been 5 UCC churches that have been formed in the Missouri Mid-South Conference. Of those 5, 1 has already closed. 2 are our Marshallese churches in Springdale, Arkansas. 1 is actually a church, a merger of 2 churches in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the last one is a true church start in Kansas City between Peace United Church of Christ, between the Disciples and the UCC. And they are going wonderfully. In fact, I'll be there, or I was just there on Sunday, celebrating the ordination of Paula Lafferty. So this is significant. We have not had a lot of churches start since 2000 in the past 18 years. And so I offer that there are ways to be building courageous relationships with 3 church starts by 2020. The time is ripe for church starts. Number 1, we've got to have a financial support of our conference church starts. And that's going to be from our conference budget and designated funds, but also it may be with our local churches and some of the possible church starts that will be coming. Number 2, we've got to identify geographic regions that currently are underserved by the UCC. St. Louis is very well served by the United Church of Christ. Kansas City is very well served by the United Church of Christ. All of the rural area along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, very well served. But what are the geographic areas in Arkansas, in Memphis, and in other places in Missouri that are not served by UCC churches that might benefit from a UCC church that offers our message and our liberating hope and love of the gospel? Third, we must equip our committees on ministry and our associations to support creative church starts. And this goes directly with our general minister and president's challenge of us to understand that church starts today are not the traditional church starts. They're what he calls 3.0 churches, which really don't look like church at all. They're not in church buildings. They don't have the shape. They're very creative. They're very social justice oriented. And in that creativity, which is wonderful, we need to make sure that our committees on ministry who oversee our churches and our ministers and our church starts are equipped in a strong way for these new creative church starts, as well as our associations, so that we can all support these church starts that begin. Fourth, I would say, in building courageous relationships is we don't have to recreate the wheel. We can learn from churches and ministers with dynamic ministries and those who have already started churches in different places and perhaps in the conference. And so the second area that I want to focus on, the second vision, is to double the ministers, the authorized ministers in the Missouri Mid-South Conference who are under 40 by 2020. Three more statistics for you. The first one from the United Church of Christ. From our statistical profile from the fall of 2017, right now, 19% of all authorized ministers in the United Church of Christ are in their 20s and 30s. 19%. That's a very interesting statistic. A statistic from the Missouri Mid-South Conference is that 5% of all of our authorized ministers in the Missouri Mid-South Conference are under 40 years old, in their 20s and 30s. And for us, that reflects 15 authorized ministers. Now here's the final statistic that is staggering, embarrassing, and our learning curve of we've got to do better. Of that 5% of our conference clergy under 40, 15 authorized ministers, 0 are ministers of color. That is not okay. That is not okay, because we have gifted ministers and ministers of color who are in their 20s and 30s, and somehow in our structure and in our system of the Missouri Mid-South Conference, and perhaps in the United Church of Christ as well, but for us in the Missouri Mid-South Conference, we must be doing better, and we must provide the kind of space where ministers of color see a place and see a vision where their ministry skills and their life experience and their very personhood created in God's image is not only welcomed, but is yearned for by our churches and by our leadership and by the Missouri Mid-South Conference. And so my challenge is that in 2 years that we will double the authorized ministers under 40 years old to 30. My goal is for us to have 30 ministers under 40 in some ministry setting in the Missouri Mid-South Conference in 2 years. Of those 30 ministers under 40 for the Missouri Mid-South Conference, my goal and challenge to us is that half of those ministers will be ministers of color. 15 new ministers of color. Now, I share this with deep commitment and reality that our conference and our denomination and our cultures in every place where we serve, right now, we have systems of racial bias. And that in those places where we have welcomed ministers of color, that we haven't done the job that we should do in order to provide the infrastructure of inclusion and hospitality to make sure that those ministers are thriving in those ministry settings, in our committees on ministry, in our associations, and in our conference. So what I offer to you is going to be hard work. It's going to be painful, but I believe that this is our growth that we can have as a conference in building courageous relationships to get to either of these goals of having younger authorized ministers in the conference and having younger ministers of color in the conference is going to require building courageous relationships with one another. Number one, I believe that we must develop seminary debt relief. We cannot expect that our ministers and our younger ministers who have $100,000 in seminary debt are going to be able to go to some of our churches that can't afford a full-time minister. We have to have a commitment of seminary debt relief. Number 2, we must identify and deconstruct the conference's systems of racial bias. And this is going to be the place where I believe where we've got to all roll up our sleeves and be committed to changing our committees on ministry, our associations, our conference council, our conference leadership. We have got to be committed to this, even in places that may be uncomfortable at this moment. Even when we want to say to one another, that's not the way that we've done this. That's not what the Manual on Ministry says. That's not what we've done, and that's not what our policies say. We have got to work together and to stay at the table with one another in this commitment of building courageous relationships in order to not only attract, but to welcome and receive the gifts of our authorized ministers in their 20s and 30s, especially those authorized ministers of color in their 20s and 30s. Number 3, we must strengthen and celebrate multiple paths. Multiple paths of ministry, meaning that a Master of Divinity is not the only way of becoming a minister in the Missouri Mid-South Conference. We have been talking about it. We have been debating about it. We have been dreading it. We have been dreaming about it. And this day is now, and we have to embrace it. We have to celebrate it, and we have to roll up our sleeves and work on how we actually bring this to fruition with integrity and authenticity for the Missouri Mid-South Conference, our local churches, and our authorized ministers. And finally, and this is a significant part that I believe has to be done, or anything else that we do is going to be worthless. And that is that we, at all levels, association, COM, conference, covenant ministry teams, we've got to be committed to creating inclusion teams to go out to our local churches to help our local churches prepare for welcoming ministers under 40 years old, especially ministers of color. Because what we don't want to do is to attract all of these younger ministers, all of these ministers in their 20s and 30s and ministers of color, and then set them up for pain and hardship and cause them trauma that may cause them to flee the church in a way that not only wounds them, but does significant trauma to their very spirits and call. That is not okay. And so what we have got to be committed to is, how do we train and support and equip and remind and help our churches, and what I'm calling inclusion teams, to go out into our local churches and help prepare our local churches that have been doing things certain ways for a long time. We can do it. And I know that we can do it because we've already done it. Some of our churches that are smaller, some of our rural churches, some of our urban churches have already done this because they've been at that moment of, are we going to die? Are we going to live? And when they chose to go in the direction of living, they opened themselves to those who are deeply gifted as authorized ministers in their 20s and 30s, and all of the gifts and the passion that they bring, and authorized ministers in their 20s and 30s who are ministers of color, and all that their passion and gifts bring to us. I know this because I was one of those younger ministers in my 30s when a local church in Houston, Texas gave me that opportunity. But they had to be ready, they had to be open, and they had to be receptive. They had to be willing to take the risk and have that courage. And I believe that our local churches have to be about this. So, my brothers and sisters, this is a longer video than I normally do, but I wanted to give all of us this opportunity to know this is our opportunity of building courageous relationships in 2018 and 2019, and our two visions of creating 3 new church starts in the next 2 years and doubling our authorized ministers who are under 40, and especially authorized ministers under 40 who are ministers of color. We can do it. I know we can, because in Christ all things are possible. So may our prayers be together that the Holy Spirit will work among us, with us, in the messiness of all that is to come, this day and forevermore. Amen.